Welcome to Dave and Dom Demystify, a FinTech Futures podcast, helping make sense of the world of FinTech and digital finance. Please sit back and listen as the two Ds take a subject and discuss it to make it clearer and easier to understand.
Demystify.
Welcome everybody to Dave and Dom Demystify, and this week's task to demystify is open banking. And I can't think of two better people to talk about this subject than C.Crosswell and Henk Van Hulle. Welcome, guys. Really pleasure to have you on the show. Can you give us a quick intro and just tell us about the organization that you work for?
Hi there. So C.Crosswell, I'm chair of the Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology, and that is what we call CFIT. And that was set up out of the Khalifa Review into UK FinTech to really push forward and action the big problems in financial innovation and drive those forward in conjunction with industry, government and regulators. I happen to be the former chair and trustee of open banking as well. So it is a subject quite close to my heart that I can never escape from, but happily still attached to it.
Henk, over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you for having me as well. Henk Van Hulle, I'm the CEO of Open Banking Limited. Open banking is a young industry. It's probably about 6.5 years young. It was born out of a competition remedy in 2016. The organization was set up in 2017 and then launched in 2018 on the back of PSD2 launch as well in January 2018. The organization has been particularly looking after standards and making sure that standards are publicly available and promoted, that they're also monitored, and to ensure as well that the benefits are there for the end users, in particular, of course, consumers and SMEs. And I hope we will talk a lot about these benefits and SMEs and consumers today as well. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. I'm going to put my cards on the table and just be honest. I'm a massive fan of open banking, and I'm really glad that kind of financial services kind of kicked off this trend towards open data, because I fundamentally believe that open data is going to be more transformative than most people realize. What do you think is holding back open banking at the moment? I mean, or is it being held back because 90% of the population in the UK isn't using it, that potentially it's not working out? What are the facts, Henk, when it comes to open banking?
Last month, when we announced the users, it is a significant achievement and actually presents really a positive momentum here and growing adoption of open banking. 1 out of 7 consumers now are using open banking. Looking at the growth rate over 18 months, that's like 66% growth. Over those 18 months, we grew from 6 million users to 10 million users. The growth in particular is happening on a serious level. So in open banking, we talk payments, payment initiation, but also data, where I hope we will talk a bit about that today as well. We see data growth is about 27% year on year in open banking. Initiation is 61%. So more use cases on payments in particular. The value, well, we listening to the Department of Business and Trade, they estimate that the value of open banking and smart data is about £28 billion. So the more smart data schemes you can have beyond open banking, including open finance, of course, the more you can increase GDP. So there's a lot of potential for growth and a lot of potential for innovation at the moment. And these are all the facts.
I'm interested because I'm really going to strip it down and ask a really dumb question. Because when I think about open banking, I tend to think about payments and giving third parties access to my bank data or my bank account. But you talk about data. What is the data that's being collected? What is the importance of that? Because many people kind of understand open banking, as I say, through that sort of more payment side of things.
Yes. So when we talk about data, non-payment information or initiation, we see, and this is very relevant also for the report that CFIT kind of calls with us here, is that a lot of data is coming from accounts themselves. So the account provisioning and the current account. So the 9 biggest banks in this country had to provide that information subject to consent and permissions. But that's where the competition remedy is working at its best, so that all these 9 banks have to open up the data of these current accounts, also business accounts. And on the basis of that, you get a better visibility, if you want, to making decisions and better informed decisions for many citizens, consumers, and businesses and small businesses. So we have fintechs and TPPs, as we call them, but fintechs and innovators just focusing just on that element alone, on data. So you could imagine, for instance, you have a thin file with a bank or another financial services provider where on the basis of that thin file, you can't make any decisions, any credit lending or suitability discussions or decisions. However, if you start to add from more and more different banks, the information, you have like a richer file now to make decisions upon. And for SMEs, that's very helpful because they get better visibility of where their money is or when it's going to come in. They can also perhaps start to optimize and then move monies to a better savings account, for instance. Also for SMEs, it's important that they want to do their business and they actually want to hand off all that financial accounting to their accountants. And nowadays, you can delegate these powers also to your accountants through your accounting softwares. And the accountant now gets an whole of market view as well of what you're doing as an SME. You can avoid late payment fees by doing so. You can start to optimize your cash flow forecasting, etc., just by having the data. So pure based on data. I have other TPPs I can mention, but I'll never mention names. But they are working on what they call non-discriminatory lending. So they have a very thin file, but they add that information into their scoring. And then they make sure that key workers, like at the NHS, public servants, can get microloans, like up to £1,000, for instance. And by doing so, they realize that actually 75% are mainly female, their customer base. So it's all of a sudden that complete underserved segment has now been served as well because of open banking, adding that richness of data to the decision-making process. And they added to that not only the lending, but also what kind of claims they could have had with, for instance, DWP or other government bodies. So the missed claims as well. So, and that's all based on information, just all based on data and nothing to do transactional in terms of payments, etc. So these are a couple of examples how you, particularly two underserved segments like SMEs and key workers, for instance, can benefit in the end from open banking data sharing.
Fantastic. So Charlotte, I mean, you were there literally from the beginning. And when I look at it, because I'm a technical person, so when I read it, I'm like, is this all it is? But I think other people, and certainly when I speak to Dave, they think there's some magic or some deep science involved in some of this stuff. How complex is this, really?
Look at the payments piece. Payments is doing account-to-account payments, or some people might call pay by bank. It's quite a simple way. It's not using a card. People like insurances. If you pay your tax by open banking, it means that you can obviously ensure that it's going straight to your account, doesn't get lost in escrow. So I think the payments piece is quite simple, hopefully. The data piece sounds complicated because, and I think there is a reticence of people who've been taught not to share their data because of security. And then suddenly we're coming along saying, oh, why don't you share your data with another provider? And you can imagine some people saying, well, who's going to use that data? How long do they have it? What's the purpose of having it? But really, open banking data is there to be shared so it can serve you better. So if we take in terms of a mortgage, a lot of people now are used to sharing their open banking data with a mortgage provider because their mortgage provider will say, oh, instead of you sending in months of statements and proving who you are, etc., let us look into your bank account for the purposes of getting a mortgage. And then that saves a lot of time. So that's automating what used to be quite a manual process. And as Henk said, when it comes to lending, what we find is actually when most of the banks are looking at lending to a consumer or an SME, they're only probably using two sources of data. They're using their own, that what they have on that consumer or SME with their bank details. And they're quite an advantage of that because they might have built up a picture. And they're using credit reference agency data. Now, of course, now in a world where data is being shared with so many different providers, you're taking financial services, products from many different providers, those two lenses don't really show the whole picture. So the task force that we've just put a report out on, shared with looking at SME finance, really showed that actually, if we were able to automate or secure additional data sources, then that would bring SMEs closer to getting a loan faster. But in some cases, would get a part of a loan or a full loan that they wouldn't have had before, because they're only looking at one part of their financial services history through their bank or the credit reference agency. So as we enter a world where obviously more and more products are available through online providers, etc., obviously the data picture is going to get more limited. And that's really where open banking comes into, because we can triangulate some of that. So how do you prove what, you've had a recurring payment from the supplier for many years? You can prove that because somebody can actually look in your bank account. You don't have to go to that supplier and say, is this true, that invoice? You can have a deep dive into that bank account. As Henk was saying, if we look at cloud accounting software providers, they collect all that data for the purposes, obviously, share with accountants and then into HMRC. But at the moment, that's where it stops. So this poor SME goes through all this painful process of doing their VAT returns, of sitting there doing their invoices, of sharing it with different providers. And then when it comes to actually that data working for them, you could argue that only some of it is being used, which may mean that those SMEs don't get a loan. And that's really what we want to look at it. We don't want everyone to think about the technical aspect of this. We want people to make sure they're being secure in their data and sharing it with a trusted third party. But we want to make sure that it's working for them. And I think that's what open banking and data is all about. It's consenting to third parties for the purpose of it benefiting you, and then stopping that consent when you don't want it to be done anymore. And obviously, we really are just at the beginning of the journey. If I look at it, we talk about open banking, and open banking was just, was obviously a remedy, as Henk said, for the 9 biggest account providers. But as we go forward and we move to a world of open finance and smart data, which is more what people are talking about, it's really saying, how do we build that picture and put that back in the hands of the customer, whether that's a consumer or SME, so they can share it when they want to and take it back. And I think that's what we want people to look at. As I always say, it's a bit like an Uber. When your Uber turns up at your house, you've called on your phone, you generally don't ask what API is being used to make the payment come out of your card account.
Well, he does.
Maybe. There may be some people out there. But really, that's what it is. We don't need to know the technical aspect of it. We just need to know that your Uber's outside your house and you know the payment's going to be made, otherwise the Uber wouldn't have turned up. And that's really what we want this to look at. It's take the complexity out of it and actually show what it can do, and show how it can either make it easier and quicker, or actually better chance of securing a loan or securing a mortgage or getting a better savings rate or getting a current account based on the fact that the data that's already being known and is being used by others about you is actually being shared with the right people. Hopefully that makes sense, Dave.
It does, because I'm sort of thinking about, with my little business account, I use Xero. And I mean, I'm presuming at some point I agreed for Xero through open banking to have access to my bank account. And Xero then works its magic in terms of so much of just running a business. But the bit I don't think it's cracked is actually, how do I grow my business in terms of, as you say, getting loans? Or that seems to be a kind of gap that is missing. Now, I don't know if that's something Xero needs to fix, or whether that's something that the banking providers need to fix, but just have smarter ways of hooking into the data that Xero has to offer. I don't know. But I conceptually, I kind of totally get where you're coming from, Charlotte.
Yeah. And I think if we take the cloud accounting software providers, it's quite interesting. We work with all of them on the task force. They have that data, but they only have it for the purposes of obviously what they're supposed to be doing with it. They're not financially regulated, so they can't share that directly unless the SME says, right, you can share that. But again, how do we prove it? So ultimately, you're constantly trying to triangulate your data sources to make sure that what somebody provides to you can be verified somewhere else. And that's all it really is. So it's not they're not doing their job. It's the fact that at the moment they are obviously licensed to provide accountancy software services. But now they obviously need to go and say, well, do they want to be financially regulated? Maybe not. So how do we, all that data you've given to them, Dave, and said, right, for the purposes of my return, I need you to do this. Well, perhaps it's back to you, and this is how we look at private sector alternatives, to say, actually, I'm happy for you to share that with someone else if it's going to help me. And I think that's we're one step removed really from building this data picture and being able to share it. And obviously we want to make sure that if an SME is sharing it, that they know it's secure and it's being shared with someone who it should be shared with. And that's what we've got to be careful of.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's important that it proves companies are in this involved as well. So yes, it could be a software company, but it could also, or a bank. But I think it also sparks off a lot of creativity and innovation for other players who could be approved with the regulators to do a certain task within the fintech world.
Fantastic. So you also announced recently that you're working together again. So you're back in the open banking space, Charlotte. Can you tell us a bit more about what CFIT is doing with the open banking?
So CFIT had it's called a coalition back at the end of last year, which we reported in February, which very much looked at open finance, so the step beyond open banking. And we had a consumer case. We worked with Citizen Advice to work out how that thin credit file that Henk talked about, how we could help Citizen Advice automate that data that they have to go through manually to get someone back in their feed. And we then had a separate use case on SME finance. I worked a lot with HSBC and IWOCA. And what that showed was 25% more loans would potentially be approved, or part loans, if more data was shared. So rather than those two sources I talked about. That obviously caught the attention of ministers, and they therefore commissioned a task force out of Treasury, which we've just reported on. So we've had everyone around that task force, the payments companies, the banks, the fintechs, the cloud accounting software providers. And because obviously this fits under the broader aspect of what happens next in open banking, Henk and the team kindly provided the secretariat for that. And I worked very closely with them to report on how we could further automate SME financing and how we can ensure that actually the smart data that's being held out there could be put to better use. And that's what the task force report is out that we published on the 1st of August, really looking at an action plan of what could be done. Part of that is obviously furthering open banking standards into open finance and smart data. But there's also some schemes that are in place on SME finance that were developed in a different world, where we didn't have this complex data around us, so therefore also need automating. So we also included recommendations around that. And that's now been delivered back into government for them to consider coming into the autumn.
Yes. And also potentially data sources. So in terms of Companies House or HMRC. So also the government could actually be a partner in sharing data, not only the private industry like open banking does, but we could expand that to more public, well, make at least some information publicly available. If we had an automated machine or a robot or an AI checking VAT returns from the HMRC database, for instance, we could very quickly improve the process of lending in this country and to UK finances as well and to SMEs. But that's not available. So some of the information which could accelerate faster decision-making and approvals and lending, some of that data isn't available yet.
Is that an example of smart data? Like you talked about smart data, both of you, and I may have missed something at the start of the conversation, but I was just kind of keen to understand exactly what that is.
Well, smart to me means, well, it's not about the volume of the data and not about what it has to be secure, safe data, high quality, things you can do with it, standardized as well through the formatting. And on the basis of that, you can be more productive and do smarter things in a way. I think that's what it does to me, because it has to fit a specific, clear value proposition so that SMEs benefit from this, but also that the provider of those services can benefit from that as well. So it is not just data.
Yeah. And I think just to add to that, Dave, is as we move to a world of smart data, and that's using the data that's held around us as consumers or us as small businesses, it's really making sure that all of that eventually gets taken into consideration. So there's been a lot of talk in smart data about energy or telecoms. They're different regulators. We are more be looking at the financial services aspect of this. And obviously, because of the impact of financial services data being used correctly, that's obviously a huge upside for what happens next. But there are other sectors as well that smart data big bang, as it's been called in the past, will be important. And eventually, obviously, you as a consumer will sit there and probably have all this data about you. It won't be just financial services. So it'll be your insurance, how you drive your car, how things are being considered, your telecoms, utility bills, etc. So eventually there will be this whole picture of you. But this is a few years down the line. But the financial services aspect of this is quite important because obviously it affects everybody. We want everyone to make sure that the money they have in accounts is being used smartly. We want to make sure the data they have that's surrounding them is used correctly. And the most important thing, as I said, is making sure that's also being done in a safe way with trusted third parties.
again, I'm really interested because from a kind of consumer point of view, my question is really the open banking has been defined from a set of standards, but it's been kind of business down to the consumer. But if I'm a consumer, like if you ask the majority of people about open banking, they'll stare at you as if you're like, what are you talking about? How do consumers know how to manage their data better, I think? And what are the handoffs like, or how do you get people to understand what's happening with their data? Because, as we kind of move into the future, there's a real danger that all of us will just sort of lose a bit of control of our data. And that can have devastating impacts on individuals, can't it? So how do you promote that, the kind of consumer view of all of this?
First of all, it is that control and choice bit already from the outset. So you control your own finances, and without your consent, it doesn't start. The whole value chain can't work. So just that alone, that promotion, but also that kind of education to the consumer that they're in control. And I think it leads to the smart link also to your other question on smart data. So what you see in more and more countries now is what we call embedded finance, so that you have propositions which spark off many other things. But like Charlotte was saying, but it's one Uber consent, one Uber. You never have to think about paying anymore. It's going to be paid. And exactly here, it sparks off many. And when you then go across sectors, you need interoperability there too. You need to be smarter again, because it might be that you have an energy deal and a savings deal and another deal all in one consent. So what you see, the evolution now is from one consent to one use case, from one consent to many use cases. And this is the first time we are confronted with this. We haven't never done this before. It was like a closed ecosystem, if I may call it that way, open banking. It was for an open banking use case. So it was a bit simpler here. Whereas now when the consumer comes into control of their own finances, you can give one consent, like your Uber consent, and you do 10 payments on the back of that. And that's only one consent. And this is where we need to be smarter in the way forward and in our technology as well, because I strongly believe that these consent will be housed in wallets one day, and that wallet will fire off anything else from a consumer perspective. So dashboards are going to be important here too, consumer dashboards, that you have immediate access as an end user through your wallet potentially, or an app where you have an overview of all the permissions you have given as an SME or consent as a consumer. And then you can restrict that consent, revoke that consent, or leave the consent, or extend the consent so that the authentication of permission is beyond 90 days, for instance. So this is kind of getting a little bit complex going forward, but it's just consumers taking control and businesses taking control, a bit like their own dashboard, cockpit, and managing it. And then from there, just move the dials. And that's a massive shift towards customer choice, centricity, and control.
So do you think that the wallets will become focused on data and permission more so than payments?
It is already happening. So I don't know what you use your wallets for, but your tickets and your whatever ticket right now you buy, your loyalty. What was in your wallet when you were in the physical world, when you had it in your back pocket?
My driving license.
Yeah.
Well, it all can be in there now, in the digital wallets, of course. So yes, a lot will move to that, and particularly on the back of tokenization. Any asset can be tokenized at a certain point. There's a lot of activity, as Charlotte was saying, in the home buying process, standardization there too of property data. Can you imagine that it's all standardized and that your house, your deed is tokenized on the back of this? Because everything needs to be linked to that title, that deed. That is tokenized into your wallet. I could ping it over to you like a P2P payment. Can you imagine that could be happening 4 or 5 years down the line?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of the dream. I was involved in the very early days of the Open Property Data Group. So
okay,
I'm very much bought into the process. What do you see, let's say, in 5 years' time? I mean, will we have more open data standards published? What will be the impact to kind of consumers in 5 years' time, let's say, or 10 years? Like, what's your vision behind this, Charlotte?
I mean, certainly, yes, it will start to get easier. We've already seen it. It's happening behind the scenes. And that's probably not a bad thing. So when someone says, would you like to share your open banking data? It's going to save you sending us in 20 documents. Of course, you're going to share it. So I don't think it's going to be the big bang, but we'll see, because there are some very smart technology entrepreneurs out there who may be able to create this dashboard that Henk was saying, and people just go, great, that's what I want. And this will probably be an age differential as well. If you take young people, anyone under 25 doesn't have a very good credit record for obvious reasons. So if they're sitting there saying, right, you want to get on the property ladder, even your first rental, let alone your first mortgage, you have to have data around you to justify that. But of course, you haven't had a history of data. So I think in 5 years' time, we're going to see probably trials of maybe even different age groups as well. And everyone said, oh, well, what about the older population? They won't be that smart. But actually, some of this could actually serve aging communities where obviously cash is at risk. People don't understand it. They're still sitting there giving a credit card to a carer to go down the shop and buy something, and they're not really getting the data on that. Well, that's not a great thing either. If we take health, we've already seen it in health. While everyone will complain about UK NHS, we already got that all in an app now. Everyone has the NHS app. HMRC, you have an app showing all of the tax and your tax records on it. If anyone hasn't downloaded the HMRC app, I highly suggest you do. And that gives you that history. So what we're actually seeing is that history has already been done. But as Henk said, it's done one consent at a time at the moment. And we are surely going to see over the next few years, one dashboard that's going to be sitting there adding things in. But it will get a bigger picture about you all the time. And then hopefully by the age of 25, the gig economy workers, won't be disadvantaged because they're a gig economy worker. They may have multiple jobs. They might hire cars through Zipcar. That's not been taken into consideration, obviously. So they haven't got insurance that's really showing that they're a safe driver. All of that we will build up in pictures. I totally agree on property. If anyone can sit there and take the friction out of buying property, which particularly UK seems to be really cumbersome, and making that easier, then that's going to be a good thing. But I think it will be use cases that move us forward in chunks. It will be people going, oh, wow. Did you know you can use this app and that's going to take the friction out of you buying a property? Then nobody's going to say no. Or if you're a young person, would you like to add something into here and you'll get a better credit file? That's going to allow you to go and rent somewhere without a parental guarantee, which many people don't have the luxury of. And I think it'll be more important for us to build on use cases than just saying, oh, let's try and do something blanket and see what people want to do. Because that's how we've done with open banking. We tried to go build it and then get everyone to come and join the party. Probably now, as we've got more comfortable with it, we'll be looking at some really great entrepreneurs who will work with the financial services ecosystem and really start to revolutionize this going forward. And that's what gets really exciting. And that's definitely within 5 years.
It's kind of interesting because I don't think we could have got to this point without going through the steps that you've both been through in terms of preparing the ground. I've got two questions, and sadly we're sort of running short on time, but one for you, Henk, which is, who do you think could be the owners of the dashboard going? Is it like a entrepreneur, or is that a space that the banks could start filling? Because they would seem like an obvious place to have, because they're the sort of conduit through all of this at the moment. So I'm just kind of interested if you've got any views on that.
I'm very excited by when you said about 5 years. I think, all the creative ideas. Look, we're talking about one here and now. It might actually come from another area where we didn't even expect it to come. As you know, we convene the industry like Charlotte did on the CFIT report here, but we convene the industry right now, for instance, on variable recurring payments and others. And it's insightful to see we're also bringing end user representative groups onto it, like the British Retail Consortium, like Small Business Federation, but also like Which and others. And it would be interesting that perhaps also consumerism could come from that area too, and not even from banks and others. And that could also span across sectors. So not only just financial services. It might not. We don't know. I think I would more and more leave things to the industry nowadays. I think it was heavily regulated and so far still open banking. And I don't think for the next smart data schemes, of course, we need data to be shared, smart data to be shared. And if that doesn't work, targeted regulation will be required. That's for sure, because you need to unlock the sharing and the value of that data. And if parties or participants are not going to share because they want to hold on to it for their own competitive reasons, then targeted regulation might be required in these sectors. And hence also the Digital Information Bill, the Smart Data Bill, that we are encouraging, of course, Parliament to accelerate, because that will give us, the industry at least, and some ministers, the powers to mandate participation as well, in case people don't want to share your energy data, for instance, or your usage on data, etc., on energy. So if a regulator is required to do so, then that bill will enable that regulator to do so.
The second question was is related. It's interesting to hear where you think this could come from, but how do you stop big tech from kind of just owning this? Because my Apple phone is basically my remote control to my life already. And I could see very quickly how Apple could go, do you know what? We've invested the time, effort and energy in advertising the fact that we'll keep all your data safe. So Dave, your identity, not just your identity, but your family's identity is safe with us, basically. But it sort of feels like that would stop competition in the way that open banking. So I'm kind of interested, what are the guardrails against big tech just owning this?
Great question, Dave, because obviously a lot of financial services feels that they've had to give away a lot of the data to other smaller providers. And as you said, there's the big tech providers who have the most data on all of us who aren't sharing that. So no doubt about it, they are a really big part of our journey as we go forward. Open banking was a remedy against those 9 providers, but the next phase surely has got to be with them around the table. I think if we wait for competition remedies to force big tech to open up pieces of data, I think we could be waiting for quite a long time. But are they going to want to be financially regulated? Maybe not. So there's no doubt about it that strategic partnerships going forward are going to be quite key on this. They already, as you said, they have the data. Everyone who says, I don't share my data, and then you can look at what they're sharing every single day. It always makes me slightly smile, because people are very nervous about it and don't realise just how much is out there. So that's when it comes down to consent. And at some point, and through the new bill that was mentioned in the King's speech, is we've got to sit there and say, right, let's put the data back to whose data it is to start with. It's your data, it's my data, it's a business's data. And you created that data. Now others have obviously had the advantage of seeing that to sell you other products or services. But really, we want this now back in the hands of the people who want to be able to use it, which is the very people who want to obviously take the advantage. And it'll be very interesting to see the role of big tech as we move that forward and how that sits alongside financial services going forward.
Yeah, we need to bring them into the fold, and they're already around our table as well on VRP. So all the big techs are there. If more and more look at world models of open banking, they're around the table with you. We are starting voluntary initiatives and groups right now, they're included as well, the big tech. And we have something really, not only data, but we will need each other's data to also fight another big thing we both have, the financial services industry and the big techs, is there is a lot of fraud going on digitally. And we all have to come together and fight that. And I think UK has published 1.3 billion this year of fraud. So if together with big tech we fight this and we reduce it just by 10%, that's 120 million. So savings, so 130. And that's growing every year, that number as well. So we can be better in fighting things together.
Fantastic. Look, we're at the top of our time, but I just want to say a thank you to both of you for sharing these insights with us and coming on to the show, but also for the fantastic work that you've done in bringing open banking to the market, because it's my involvement in other sectors has highlighted that it's been the kind of guideline for other sectors to open up their data as well. So it's hugely important. And thank you very much, both of you.
Well, yeah, and thank you. And, as interesting as I've talked to people all around the world who realise that actually what we set up in the UK was a framework which other people have kind of copied. So congratulations to you both, I think, in terms of leading the way on this important topic, which will have a huge impact into the future on all of our lives.
Appreciate the invite. Yeah, if anyone does want to read the report we've just finished, you can find that on the CFIT website under SME Finance Task Force report.
Fantastic.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Dave and Dom Demystify. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tune in next time as we take another topic and demystify it.